Okay. Hello, my name is Eliana Treyson. I'm the Director of Public Relations for the World Jewish Congress. I'd like to introduce Dr. Laurence Weinbaum, who is the Director of the Israel Council on Foreign Relations, which runs under the auspices of the WJC, and he's the Acting Director General of WJC Israel, as well as a historian of the Holocaust. Thank you very much to the Ukraine Crisis Media Center for having us.
Szanowni Państwo, dobry dzień.
Good afternoon, dear friends. I'm very glad that I'm here with you today. But the truth is that we have difficult times to meet. So,
to discuss what we've come here to speak about, permit me to offer on behalf of the President of the World Jewish Congress, Ambassador Ronald S. Lauder, his condolences. He asked that we express before the Ukrainian media his profound sorrow at the passing of Shimon Peres, a great Israeli statesman and certainly the last person of his era, somebody who played an active role in the creation of the State of Israel and in ensuring its security and well-being over the course of many generations. As some of you know, Shimon Peres was actually born in this part of the world. He was born in what is present-day Belarus, but before the Second World War was a part of Poland. And had he not had the good fortune to leave his native land and come to the land of Israel very shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, he probably would have shared the fate of the great majority of Jews who lived here. And I draw to your attention, it isn't always remembered that the great majority of Jews in the world lived in the tremendous belt of territory from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This was the home of millions of Jews who met a fate that is very hard for us to imagine, and very few of whom survived. Well, we've come here actually today to remember the terrible tragedy that befell the Jews of Kiev and the surrounding areas at Babyn Yar 75 years ago today. I think those of us who have studied the history of the Holocaust, of course, recognize that this tragedy had a significance beyond the destruction of men, women, and children, but as being a certain stage in the evolution of German plans to wipe out the Jewish people, what they called in the Nazi parlance the final solution. Well, permit me just to offer a personal reflection. The first time I visited Ukraine was at the end of the 1980s, when this was still Soviet Ukraine. Today, when I was traveling from our hotel to the Media Crisis Center along the Kreshatyk, and I saw that the boulevard was decorated with Israeli and Ukrainian flags in honor of the visit of the President of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, I thought to myself that had somebody asked me at that time when I was a young man in Soviet Ukraine, could you imagine a situation in which you would return here decades later and you would see, first of all, an independent Ukraine reborn, the President of the State of Israel, the President of the Jewish state, being welcomed in Kiev, the capital of independent Ukraine, as an honored guest, and the occasion being a commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the destruction of the Jews of Kiev. I tell you honestly, I would not have been able to imagine such a turn of events. So this in itself is something, at least on a personal level, and I am sure that I am speaking for many of my colleagues and for many of my friends who have come from Jewish communities all over the world to be with us here today, this is something that we find uplifting, and it's something very encouraging. Well, when we speak about the way in which this state of affairs has come to be and what is happening today in independent Ukraine, I mean, of course, we recognize the tremendous trials that this country is facing, challenges that would be very difficult to overcome even for a people and a country that had enjoyed an uninterrupted period of independence over the course of many generations, which of course Ukraine does not enjoy. So we are quite aware of the difficulties in creating a cohesive society. And so therefore we are very gratified and we are very grateful to the Ukrainian authorities for enabling us to be here, for organizing the ceremonies that are taking place and all the various side events which we do hope will raise public consciousness about the terrible tragedy that took place in this part of the world. That being said, there are of course developments that are taking place which are, I might say, give us pause. It has to be made very clear from our point of view that the tragedy of the Jews of Ukraine that took place here at the instigation of according to German plans, one was a specific action directed against the Jewish people for no other reason that they were Jews, and that sadly there were local elements, there were elements in the local population that did participate for whatever their motivations, whether they were motivated by hatred, whether their motivation was greed, pecuniary enrichment, or nationalism, who did play a part in that. And unfortunately, this is something that we cannot sweep under the carpet. That being said, it's very clear that one cannot make any kind of generalization. We recognize also with tremendous respect the vast numbers of Ukrainians who played a part in eventually eliminating the scourge of Nazism and bringing to an end this murderous policy directed against Ukrainian and European Jewry. Hundreds of thousands of millions, in fact, soldiers from Ukraine fell in the ranks of the armies that fought against Nazi Germany. And it's very important for us to remember and honor their memories as well, even if we do draw attention to the fact that there were local people who played what we might call a very unsavory role in facilitating the dispatch of their Jewish neighbors. I think that certainly coming to terms with the very complex historical legacy that faces Ukraine is one of the challenges of Ukrainian society, and I don't have any doubt that the way in which Ukrainian society comes to deal with this, and this, we're talking about a process that will take many years, it may take generations, will certainly, at least to a great extent, define the success or failure of Ukrainian civil society. And so this is, of course, a challenge that cannot that cannot be avoided. And it is my hope, at least my personal hope as somebody who regards himself as a sincere well-wisher, that over time this narrative will eventually be accepted and absorbed by Ukrainian society. I think I've probably spoken longer than I should have, and I am very happy to take questions from the audience, from the journalists who are gathered here.
Thank you very much. Друзі, чи є запитання? Будь ласка, представте.
Do you have questions? Please introduce yourself first.
It was a very interesting meeting yesterday. A group of Ukrainian Jews who served the Ukrainian army came to Kiev to remember victims of the Babyn Yar. And we were talking about situation in the east of Ukraine, and that guy said that it's possible to combine the beginning of Israeli statehood and situation in Ukraine at present. Do you think the experience of organizing formation and development of Israeli state will be useful and is useful for Ukraine at present? Thank you.
It's interesting, in the course of my travels, I have been in many post-communist states, throughout the length and breadth of Central and Eastern Europe, and I am often asked this question: does the Israeli experience offer something to emerging countries? And I would argue that certainly it does, because as you know, Israel was a country that had disappeared from the map, well, many generations ago, and certainly the story of the national rebirth of the Jewish people in the land of Israel is something that is uplifting. I think it's inspiring, and on a more practical level, I don't doubt that it does have some relevance to countries that have reemerged and that are facing, well, serious, if not existential challenges in the future. I think that, and I was asked this once not long ago in an interview on the Ukrainian television, and I said, well, I mean, above all, the fact that you can build some national cohesiveness and the very high motivation of Israelis to serve and defend their country is something that should be noted by countries that find themselves or understand themselves to be in a similar situation.
Do you have some further questions? Чи є ще запитання?
Do you have other questions? Please ask. So the question in Ukrainian. Sergei Kutnikov, Maninform Agency. Mr. Laurence, and according to the estimates of the specialists, in Babyn Yar, about 120,000 people were killed by Nazis. And the Babyn Yar Museum believes that there were about 50,000 Romans and Jews were killed there, and others were prisoners of war, and also Ukrainian uprising army participants, mainly Ukrainians, and they are all residents of Ukraine and the citizens of the Soviet Union at that time. What is your opinion? Can we believe that Ukraine and Ukrainians are victims in this genocide and Holocaust? Can we believe that this is a Holocaust of Ukrainian nation as well?
To answer your question, which is a complex one, in the brief time that I am allowed, and so you'll forgive me if the answer cannot be very nuanced. I don't think there is any misunderstanding that the number of victims at Babyn Yar included many non-Jews as well, and that in fact numerically the number of non-Jews exceeded the number of Jews who were killed on this site over the course of many years. But when we are drawing attention to the destruction of the Jews, we are talking about the destruction of a large number of people in a very short period of time, in fact less than 48 hours, as being an almost unprecedented act of mass murder, and one that was directed against the Jewish population. So I don't think that if we draw attention to that as being one aspect of what took place here, we are denying what happened to other people, whether they were ethnic Ukrainians, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, or others. And I think it's very important to make that clear. It's interesting to me also that you pointed out that this was done by the Nazis. I personally have a difficulty in using that terminology. Maybe this isn't the place to say that, but my fear is that in successive generations, if we don't identify the killers by name, and we have to ascribe most of the guilt for what happened at Babyn Yar to Germans, then we are not representing history accurately, and this will not be understood. So I would not even use the expression Nazis. I would say this was an act that was perpetrated as a part of the policy of Nazi Germany, though it was facilitated by local collaborators. And by the way, in pointing to the local collaborators of Ukrainian nationality, please understand there were local collaborators of many different nationalities throughout Europe. And it's not that anybody is pointing a finger specifically to acts of omission or commission on the part of Ukrainians. But if we are speaking about Babyn Yar, that's why we are drawing attention to this. I don't know whether I have answered your question to your satisfaction. I certainly wouldn't say that we should speak about the terrible suffering of the Ukrainian people, which is undeniable. Ukrainians suffered a terrible fate during Soviet occupation. There's no question about it. Millions of people perished. But again, I make a distinction. I am an historian. I am a scholar of history. And therefore, in discussing what happened to the Ukrainian nation, whether in the 1930s or during the Second World War or in the years following the war, I don't put that in the same basket as I do what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust. Not because it wasn't a terrible story, undoubtedly it was, but again, it's a different story. And by the way, forgive me just to add one thing more. You know, it is often pointed out in these kinds of discussions, well, how is it that people who were victims could themselves become perpetrators? This is not something unusual. If you look at Europe under German occupation during the Second World War, or countries that were allied with Germany, there were cases, by the way, in which nations were repressed, persecuted, and sometimes were murdered. So they were victims. But they were also at times perpetrators, and there shouldn't be any misunderstanding that it is possible at the same time to be a victim, but also to be a perpetrator.
We have one more question.
Sergey Bali, 24th channel, and I would like to ask you, the president of the Ukrainian Jewish Congress, Babyn Yar, said that some positive activities, I mean concerts or so on, it's kind of dances on the bones. Did you notice some such examples in Ukraine or over the world?
Well, you've asked a question that, in my mind, transcends the issue of how we are remembering here in Kiev the destruction of the Jews at Babyn Yar. You're asking a question about how the memory of the Holocaust should be transmitted and whether there is a place for public commemoration ceremonies and whether those ceremonies include a scholarly content, let's say discussions of historians, whether they include discussions of philosophers or a musical component. And I don't presume that all of us will agree on what is the best way to do this. But I don't doubt that in organizing these kinds of ceremonies, you are raising public consciousness about these events. And I think that in itself is something important. In other words, if during these ceremonies people begin to question what happened at Babyn Yar and say, you know what, I grew up in Soviet Ukraine, I never even heard about this place, and suddenly I realize that at my doorstep a terrible tragedy took part about which I knew nothing, I will have considered that it was successful that these commemorations take place. I mean, to be sure, commemorations are to pay homage to the dead, but they are also very much for the living in order to heighten our understanding about these things to the extent that we can understand them.
Чи є ще запитання або уточнення, колеги? We don't have further questions, so at this point the press conference is finished.
Thank you very much.
This
Looking forward to seeing you here in the nearest future. Thank you.